Welcome to Lana's Crash Course, which is really just a Lana's Sad Required Book Club. Today we will be discussing Animal Training 101, chapters 1 and 2. So the book really starts off with a chapter 1 called Overview. Super exciting, I know. But the first sentence I find really spoke to me. It states that the purpose of this book is to explain how to get an animal of any species to both understand and to choose to do what you want. A process otherwise called behavior modification. I really like how in this definition she chooses to include choice as well. I find that oftentimes, like even when I was training my dog, with the dog books that you find, very rarely in our definition of training or behavior modification do we innately include choice. And it talks about how animal training is a mix of behavioral science and art form. And that this book was designed for those actively working with animals, including humans, towards a specific desired objective. This is where the light bulb started to go on with me in terms of how we could apply this to just more than like animals that we think of. And then I really touch on that in the next chapter. But she has this way of writing that I think is very important too, and overall adds to this whole course and why we chose this book. It's written in a scientific way. It's an academic writing, but it's not so dry and boneless that one would be disinclined to pick it up. She uses this phrase that I think is really important to the way that she writes as well. She calls it neither a cookbook nor a textbook. And in terms of academic writing, especially for something that there's tons of books on, so many people want to know about animal training to train their dog. There's so much misinformation in schools of thought. She goes, I will attempt to unify the approaches, meaning the art form and the science, a solid foundation in the psychological sciences and the practice art of animal training without being married to a particular discipline or school of thought. And I think that's really important when you're discussing textbooks. Or not necessarily, I guess textbooks wouldn't be the right word, animal training books. I think it's important that they be written for someone as experienced as, your seasoned orca trainer to Joe Schmo at home just trying to figure out how their dog works, which leaves us on to, and she covers a lot of the foundations in the beginning, which I'm not really going to go into because we're going to touch on that in later chapters, leading us to chapter 2. My overall takeaway from chapter 2 can be summed up with teaching equals conditioning. So this was a huge light bulb moment for me, and it literally starts out in the first beginning. She says that teaching equals conditioning, and this was a huge light bulb moment for me as an autistic person that has admittedly learned how to blend in. This spoke to me because honestly, if I see no difference between my lab partner and Ping the rabbit when it comes to trying to figure out what they're thinking half the time. If it's not blatantly obvious and they're not giving out like innate behavioral and social cues, I'm struggling. But so many times we associate conditioning or, as she says, the unnecessary distinction between working with animals, conditioning, and working with humans, teaching. They're one and the same, and this is just phenomenal and just rocked my world. She goes on to say that training is learning through human interaction. And most of what we understand about the mechanics of learning translates well between species. And most of what we know about human behavior comes from our understanding of animal behavior. Now, if I've learned one thing from this anthrozoology program, it's that We're all just machines. And this chapter 2 in my training book has just reinforced this idea that we're all just machines. Also, if I really wanted to, I can train my siblings to say do fun things, as well as my dogs. And I live for that. Honestly, this is like a game changer.